Hello, everyone. Today, I want you to start not with complex theories, but with the most valuable realities in our lives, things that surround us every day without us even realizing it. Because the most vital things often become visible because they are closest to us. For example, first, air. You are breathing right now, and you are probably not aware of it. However, for a little over a minute, without any interruption, all your plans, all your savings, all your worries instantly become meaningless. Air is life itself, but we don't fully remember its value because it is so important to us. It's right under our noses, but our minds wander miles away. Second, water. Our bodies are almost 70% water. That is, we are far more integrated than we think. Our cells, our thoughts, even our savings are all part of a collection. Water is usually easily accessible, but we rarely change our understanding of how water nourishes us. Just like our lives. We only realize how fragile what we have is when we face the possibility of losing it. And thirdly, time. Perhaps the quietest, most invisible, but also the most ruthless. How much time do we have? Tomorrow? 10 years? 50 years? Nobody knows. But strangely, we can allocate time for everything. Work, people, responsibilities, rushing around. When it comes to ourselves, we choose to say, I don't have time. Yet the most valuable use of time is when people can be alone with themselves. The question you should ask yourself is, if our brain is truly connected to the universe, when do we listen in this way? Wherever you are, plan to set aside time in some way. But this is not a social media break. This is not time set aside to consume things. This is time set aside simply to stop. Be away from everyone. Stay away from systems, expectations, roles, labels. You don't have to do anything. You don't have to answer. Just stop. Look at where you came from. Ask yourself where you're really going. Try looking from the outside, from the sidelines, systematically. Is this really your current choice? Or is it the result of being killed, of fears, of individual expectations? Are you living your life, or are you playing a script you've been taught? The deepest aspect of quantum consciousness begins here. Because consciousness isn't just thinking. Consciousness is awareness. And awareness is when a person begins to feel their connection with the universe again. Perhaps your brain is already connected to the universe. Perhaps you never lost it. Perhaps it's your hearing ability that you've had for a very long time. Remember, like air, water, and time, your consciousness has always been there. The question isn't, does this connection exist? The real question is, when are you ready to hear it? This question is one of the most fundamental and unsettling questions in modern science, because its answer reveals just how much subjectivity there is in something most people take for granted throughout their lives. The brain, not a camera, but an interpreter. The human brain is not just a camera recording the outside world. Scientists have been saying this for years. The brain selects, filters, shortens, rearranges information from the environment, and then presents us with a story. Therefore, you think you are seeing something, but what you are actually seeing is a story that shows the size of your brain changing. David Eagleman and The Internal Representation of Reality. Neurologist David Eagleman argues that instead of a universal reality, the center has a reality constructed within itself. That is, you are not confronted with the universe, but with an internal world created for you by your brain. What does this mean? Color, sound, time, even the sense of self. These details have no objective counterpart in the external world. The brain allows these details to be recreated in its own internal world from the reality of this life. For example, there is no such thing as red in the universe. Red is a meaning created in our brains by specific light wavelengths. What percentage of things do you notice that you don't see with your eyes? The brain has to manage the bombardment of information from the environment because data flows to it through our eyes. If our brain stored everything and presented it to us as is, our memory couldn't handle the load. Therefore, the brain filters out information that is not necessary for survival. An example from daily life. On the street. In a country, thousands of people, lights, vehicles, advertisements, sounds, and smells reach your brain simultaneously. However, you only perceive a few differences among them. How to cross the road. The red light. The person coming from the opposite direction. Your phone. Everything else is classified as unimportant and sent to your consciousness. This means reality is for survival for the brain. Perceptual illusions. How does the brain deceive reality? One of the clearest examples of this idea is perceptual illusions. 1. Two squares that look like diamonds, but are the same color. In some visual illusions, two squares appear different, even though they are the same color. The brain, by adding light and shadow, thinks they are different. This shows us that the brain interprets the world not as objective, but as meaningful. 2. Is it a blue dress or black and blue? The dress phenomenon that swept the internet in 2015 led people to see the same photograph with completely different color perceptions. Some saw the dress as blue and black, others as white and gold. This event clearly demonstrates how the brain interprets light and how this interpretation alters reality. The brain rewrites reality based on past experiences. The brain produces reality not only through the senses, but also through past experiences. Expectation alters perception. If you label something as dangerous, it actually appears better. For example, if a person sees a deep shadow and thinks it's a thief, the fear hormone increases, and the brain interprets this shadow as more dangerous. In this case, the brain is rewriting reality according to a pre-learned scenario. Reality is also shaped by society and language. Language and culture are among the biggest filters shaping our perception. Different languages create different worlds. If a language doesn't have a word to express a particular emotion, it can be difficult to experience that emotion. For example, in some languages, sadness and longing are expressed with the same word. In some languages, happiness has a much more limited meaning. This means language is about accumulating thoughts and perceptions, cinema and reality. How can we show that the brain is a printer? Cinema is a wonderful laboratory for how to operate a computer. Inception. This film shows how the brain generalizes the boundary between dream and reality. Even in dreams, a meaning is formed, and this meaning is blended with reality. The Matrix. The Matrix claims that reality is actually a simulation. This film symbolizes a brain-created alteration, where what modern man accepts as real is actually a simulation. Cinema confronts us with the fragility of our reality, and this confrontation is actually parallel to science. Reality is constructed not only externally, but also internally. The brain also creates the sense of self. What we call self may be a product of the brain. Neuroscience research shows that the brain's self is constantly being updated. This feeling is not just the product of an organ, but the brain's attempt to define itself as a whole. In other words, the self is not an entity independent of the external world. It is your brain's process of defining you as a person. In short, is reality a filter or a fixed structure? Science tells us this. There may be a reality in the external world, but we experience this reality as our brain filters it. This filter shapes our perception through our senses, past experiences, expectations, culture, language, and the brain's survival features. So the reality is this. Your brain is giving you a choice, a meaningful model. And the real question is, how much of reality does our brain allow us to see? Perhaps that's the most important question, because the brain can reflect reality to protect you. This keeps you alive, but it can also distance you from reality. A normal person means a conformist person. In a society, the person considered normal is usually not the most intelligent or the most thoughtful. A normal person is the one who best conforms. Therefore, normal is not a biological definition. It is a social agreement. That is, being normal is not an innate trait. It is a learned behavior to be accepted. Normal, society's common seal of conformity. Societies create a set of rules and norms to ensure their survival. These norms determine people's behavior, thoughts, and greatness. What can you say? How much do you show? How much can you question? How different can you be? The answers to these questions define society's framework of normal. And those who remain within this framework are declared healthy, while those who step outside are declared strange or dangerous. Foucault and the social construction of mental illness. Michel Foucault argued that the concept of mental illness is not merely a medical definition, but also a control mechanism to maintain social order. In other words, classifying a behavior as sick often depends more on the individual's conformity than on the individual themselves. This raises the question, is the individual's problem truly a problem, or is it a difference that the system finds disturbing? Because throughout history, many thinkers, dissidents, and scientists have been branded as unstable, or dangerous, or even silenced. The system's expectations of people schools, workplaces, institutions, and the state all demand predictable people. Why? Because predictable people follow the rules, are productive, do not challenge the system, obey. People who question, think differently, or react are a risk to the system because they can disrupt the system's continuity. Therefore, throughout history, people who thought differently have been excluded, despised, marginalized, and even punished. Adaptive behavior, health or survival. In psychology, adaptive behavior refers to an individual's ability to act in harmony with their environment. This behavior is not a sign of current mental health, because sometimes adapting is a survival strategy, a defense mechanism, a method of self-protection. A person may diminish themselves to conform to societal conditions. They hide their questions, they suppress their emotions, they hide for varying periods. They conform to a pattern defined as normal. This is self-discipline undertaken to avoid exclusion. The normal person cannot see a wider reality. Being normal often means a narrowing of reality, not an expansion. This means remaining within the boundaries drawn by society. This can limit your thoughts, your feelings, your lifestyle, your imagination, even your conscience. And remaining in this isolation makes one a conformist, but it also makes one ordinary. History tells us that those who change are not the conformists, but the nonconformists. True transformation comes not from those who conform, but from those who refuse to conform. Newton published a report questioning reality. Darwin read nature not as it was, but from a different perspective. Galileo questioned the changes within the system. Tesla pushed the boundaries of normal. These people may have been ostracized in their time, but the progress of the day was a result of their nonconformity, because the system remembers not those who constantly conform, but those who create a new reality. The price of being normal in everyday life. The same thing continues today. On social media, being normal is defined as being the same, wanting the same things, having the same products, living within the same patterns. This means people who think differently are excluded by the system. But remember, the person who thinks differently is usually the dominant person in the world. Conclusion: a normal person means a conformist person. A normal person usually doesn't see the absolute truth. They are the best conformists. Therefore, normal is not a judgment. It's a conformity strategy. And the real question is, are you living to be normal or to live your own truth? Because the world belongs not to those who conform, but to those who refuse to conform. Why do geniuses always live on the edge? When we talk about geniuses, most people immediately imagine great achievements, great corruption, and great brilliance. But behind this facade often lies suffering, loneliness, conflict, and living on the edge. Throughout history, people who have achieved great things have one thing in common. They live not in the center of their minds, but on the edges. But why? To do this analysis, we need to understand that genius is not measured solely by mental capacity. It is also measured by the way they perceive the world, their forms of reality, and the social relationships they establish. 1. Living on the edge, not being in the center. Isaac Newton was not only a scientist, but also a laboratory of the mind. Those who read his life story see that he lived not only with genius, but also with an obsession, a fixation, an inner peace. Newton's life, in our context, shows that this was not just a talent. It also created mental tension. His sleep pattern was irregular. He forgot to eat. He spent long periods alone. He felt the need for constant programming. This obsession of Newton's distanced him from the ordinary, but it also made him one of the greatest thinkers of the human condition. At this point, to understand why he lived on the edge internally, the following fact is an acceptable statement. Geniuses see the world not as acceptable, but as questionable. 2. Darwin. A great discovery, a great price. Charles Darwin lived a life similar to Newton's in this respect. Darwin changed the world with his theory of evolution. But this change created a great psychological storm within itself. On Darwin's side, long-term anxiety disorders, stomach problems, social isolation, chronic fatigue, and so on. This is not just the spread of a sickly story. It also involves having a physical body that can change at the edge of the mind. Geniuses perceive things like normal people in the world. They notice an order, a paradox in nature before others. This awareness creates mental breadth. 3. Living on the edge means thinking outside the box. Neuroscience and innovation research suggests that original thinking often stems from a weakening of traditional perception patterns. The thought patterns in a person's mind are like a kind of autopilot. Most people live on this autopilot. They accept the same ideas. They repeat the same things. They revolve in the same patterns. But internally, they constantly break this autopilot. They do. They don't accept the ready-made explanations offered by the environment. They constantly question. They break things down. They put them back together. This mental process makes them different, but this also isolates them from society. 4. The inquiring mind, the price of creativity. In psychological literature, this is called inquiry. Inquiring minds experience the difference between the inner and outer worlds with greater permeability. This permeability is also a kind of geniuses. Perceive the environment more deeply, have more intense resources. Parts flow faster, make new connections. This makes them creative. But this can also cause emotional fluctuations, sleep, socialization, loneliness, socialization. In other words, being inside is as much a gift as it is a price. 5. Film examples. Minds living on the edge of the abyss. We can look at the flow of cinema to see how the situation can change. For example, the film A Beautiful Mind shows how John Nash's life is lived on the edge of being inside. Nash. Constant questioning of the connections made with reality. You see the world as a different code. The mind constantly shifts it to another reality. The film is, on the one hand, a great creative force, and on the other hand, a great mental exhaustion. This example reminds us, genius is not just a talent, it is also a mental risk. 6. A common characteristic of minds living on the edge of the abyss, emotional intensity. Many geniuses also lead intense emotional lives. They see colors more vividly. They understand music more deeply. They may be more vulnerable in the face of human abundance. They can feel both great love and great pain at the same time. This emotional intensity allows them to perceive the world differently, but it also makes them vulnerable. Therefore, geniuses often face loneliness, struggle under socialism, have non-earthly aspects to their world. This loneliness is one of the greatest costs of genius. 7. The boundary expands reality. The center maintains order, but the boundary expands reality. Geniuses choose the boundaries, not the center, because staying in the center is difficult. Staying on the boundary is difficult, but staying on the boundary allows a new reality to be seen. Geniuses exist for the people of the world and are often ostracized by society. The man who dared to measure consciousness, Isaac Bentov. Throughout human history, consciousness has often been treated as a mystery, a spirituality, a sacredness. Many thinkers, in discussing consciousness, have seen it as a gateway to the supernatural realm. It was believed that the key to opening this gate lay only in inner means. However, Isaac Bentov was one of the rare individuals who rejected this approach. Instead of isolating consciousness as a mystical concept, Bentov chose to treat it as a measurable, testable, and clinically logical phenomenon. This choice made him not only a spiritual figure, but also an engineer with scientific courage. 1. Bentov's engineering origins, seeking the mechanical aspect of consciousness, not the emotional aspect. 1 of Isaac. Bentov's greatest strengths was his search for consciousness not in the imagination, but as a mechanical system. He was trained as a mechanical engineer, and much of the stored information showed that it was kept separate from the most sensitive areas of medicine. His role in the development of medical devices, such as heart protection devices, demonstrates his mastery of biological and physical fields. Bentov's structural approach to consciousness is not like an artist's approach to a spiritual painting. An engineer's system is different. Instead of leaving consciousness as a mystery, he sought to learn how it arises, what mechanisms it programs, and what frequencies it interacts with. This approach explains why it sparked debate in the scientific world. Because Bentov relied on experiment, measurement, and logic rather than sanctifying consciousness. 2. The limits of consciousness. The division between heart and brain. Perhaps Bentov's most radical claim was this: the center of consciousness was not just the brain. The heart and its rhythm were also part of this process. Modern neuroscience defines the communication between the heart and the brain as heart-brain communication. Research in this area reveals that the heart is not just a pump, but also constantly exchanges information with the brain. The heart functions like a kind of language within the body. Its rhythm, its variability, its relationship with stress and emotion sends signals to the brain. Bentov's idea began to be validated in modern science as heart-brain interaction. That is, the heart's rhythm doesn't just stop there. It can be part of the mind. This was a serious challenge to the classical view that consciousness is just the brain. 3. Frequencies and resonance. Consciousness. Speaking in waves, Bentov chose consciousness as a resonant system. In physics, resonance refers to a system vibrating at a particular frequency, and the meaning of the components of another system being consistent with this choice. This is a phenomenon such as the vibration of a guitar string being at the same frequency as the vibration of another string. Bentov believed that consciousness could be studied in a similar way. If the human mind vibrates at a certain frequency, it can synchronize with another mind. This claim could be presented as a traditional mystical idea. However, Bentov did not leave it as just an idea. He tried to transform it into a measurable model. This was an attempt to frame the system of consciousness. 4. Bentov's definition of consciousness: systematic, not spiritual. Bentov's greatest strength was that instead of treating consciousness as a spiritual phenomenon, he defined it as a system. A system operates with specific inputs. It functions according to specific rules. It produces specific outputs. Bentov's understanding of consciousness can be summarized as follows. Inputs: senses, environment, bodily rules, frequency, resonance, rhythm. Outputs: perception, transience, sense of self. This was different. Awareness was not just an experience, but a process. Bentov sought to understand consciousness rather than glorify it. This was a major advance for science. 5. Experimental courage on consciousness. Bentov's methods of study are the most important feature that distinguishes him from a mystical figure. Many people experience consciousness through personal experience. Many mystics believe that consciousness is recorded through inner enlightenment. However, Bentov used frequencies to make consciousness measurable, treated heart rhythm and brain waves as a system. This approach was not easily accepted in the scientific world. The measurability of consciousness also shakes the comfort politics of the scientific world. Therefore, Bentov's claims led to controversy in some circles. 6. Bentov and consciousness technology. Reflections in the modern era. Bentov's ideas, which were systematic, are now being spread in places like biofeedback, neurofeedback, and officially monitored access. For example, EEG, brainwave measuring devices, signs of heart rhythm variability, brain during brainwave changes, regulation of brainwaves in a flow state. Modern knowledge such as these shows that information is not just an experience, but a measurable process. The ideas Bentov put forward in the 1960s are now being officially tested. This explains why he was considered progressive. 7. Bentov's most disturbing claim: consciousness is not just the brain. Bentov's claim was perhaps the most disturbing. Consciousness is not just a process occurring in the brain. It can be part of the home, the environment, and the universe. This was an idea that challenged the boundaries of the classical scientific world. Therefore, Bentov was often met with skepticism in academic circles. But Bentov did not see skepticism as a problem. He believed that the fundamental doubt of science is always based on measuring, testing, re-evaluating. Bentov applied this process to consciousness. 8. Bentov's legacy: making consciousness researchable, not sacred. Bentov's work was not about sanctifying consciousness. It was about making it researchable. This is a huge step for humanity, because consciousness is one of humanity's greatest mysteries. And if consciousness can be measured, psychological treatment can be better treated. Mental problems can be better treated. Viruses, and what is not applicable to viruses, can be studied. Self-knowledge can be based on a more solid foundation. Bentov's approach is not just an idea. It is a method for humanity. 9. Why is Bentov's courage important? Ethok. Bentov's greatest courage was his refusal to see consciousness as a sacred mystery, just an experience, just a spiritual journey. He chose consciousness as a system, and he argued that this system is harmonious with frequencies, rhythms, the body, the environment. Bentov tried to understand consciousness without glorifying it, and therefore he touched upon one of the greatest areas of debate in the scientific world: the hidden connection between heart rhythm, the brain, and the world's frequency. The human body is often thought of as merely a biological machine. However, when we step back and begin to examine the inner world, we realize that the heart is not just an organ that pumps blood, but also one of the most powerful sources of energy, because the heart produces a rhythmic electromagnetic field that directly affects not only physical activity, but also the brain and nervous system. This effect is a fact that has been known in modern neuroscience for many years. The brain's waves are nourished not only by internal processes, but also by external rhythms. And the rhythm of this center, breaths, and emitted bands emerge as a means of synchronization that shapes the brain's functioning. One of the most interesting aspects of this emission is that a person feels more open, more attentive, more introverted, and at the same time more integrated in certain frequency ranges. The 7 to 8 Hz range lies at the boundary of theta and alpha waves, and this range is associated with deep relaxation, imagination, detachment, introspection, and intense activity. Because at these frequencies, the brain processes complex internalizations from the external world, amplifies internal radiation, and allows for better contact with one's own inner world. Here, a very interesting fact about the world itself emerges. The Earth is a vibrating planet, and its atmosphere, ionosphere, and electromagnetic fields vibrate regularly within a certain natural frequency range. One of these frequencies, 7.83 Hz, known in science as the Schumann resonance, seems more like a law of nature than a coincidence due to the close frequencies of the Earth and the human brain. The Schumann resonance is a phenomenon first theoretically predicted and later confirmed by Winfried Otto Schumann in the 1950s. The ionosphere, stretching between the Earth and the planet, acts like a giant cable. and the broad waves produced within this formation ring like a bell at certain frequencies. This ringing is concentrated around 7.83 Hertz. This doesn't mean the human brain automatically synchronizes with the Earth, as living systems remain constant at a single frequency, and each individual has an internal rhythm that varies according to age, health status, living conditions, and metabolic factors. However, it is a systemically accepted fact that living systems are sensitive to rhythms, and that regular selections from the external environment, especially low-frequency waves, will be reproduced by biological systems. This acceptance is not merely theoretical. It is a phenomenon observed in both clinical experience and clinical heart rate studies. When the heart rate slows and becomes more regular, breathing deepens, and brain waves approach theta alpha limits, people often feel that time is passing. Thoughts are calming, and the inner voice is louder, and the body is coming together in a lighter and more integrated way. And these experiences are reported through individual practices such as yoga, breathwork, biofeedback, and mindfulness. In this context, modern scientists refer to the communication between heart rhythm and brain waves as heart-brain communication, and studies show that this communication is critical not only for physical health, but also for psychological well-being, stress management, emotional regulation, and even social connection. For example, studies on heart rate variability, HRV, reveal that higher HRV is associated with better stress management, stronger empathy, and more complex emotional control. However, one of the most important aspects of understanding this variability is to recognize the heart not just as a pump, but as an organ that generates a powerful potential field in the body. The heart has physiological effects on the brain because the waves produced by the heart rhythm send conduction and nervous system signals throughout the body, and these signals can lead the brain to create a rhythm. Therefore, Bentov's approach parallels modern science. If the heart is considered not only a physical organ, but also a rhythm center, it shows that consciousness is strengthened not only within the brain, but also through the timing of all activities and instantaneous events. This is particularly observed in the flow experience. Athletes, artists, musicians, and those working in high-performance, intermittent jobs experience a point where they forget time. And during this experience, it is observed that their capacities at low frequencies are regulated, their heart rhythms are regulated, and their breathing slows down. This shows us that even focusing on an external, comprehensive goal can create a synchronization in the inner world. This relaxation means a kind of less work for the brain, because instead of making complex decisions, the brain surrenders to the natural data of the rhythm, and thus internal signals become dominant. The boundary between the outer and inner worlds becomes more permeable because the brain's attention system reduces stimuli from the outer world and turns towards the inner world. This is not a skill to be acquired in the future. More specifically, the nervous system functions differently, and this functioning can be improved through regular exercise, breathing techniques, and a healthy lifestyle. Because modern brain recordings reveal that people who exercise regularly show more alpha and theta activation in their brain waves and improved heart rate variability. This is a kind of internal rhythm training. Like a musician tuning their instrument, a person can regulate their own rhythm, making their mind calmer, more focused, and clearer. This process is not just a matter of personal development. It is also a field of medicine. For example, conditions such as chronic stress, anxiety, and current events can disrupt the heart-brain sleep. And this disruption can negatively affect both the physical and psychological state of a person. So modern medicine has begun to integrate treatment methods such as heart rate variability and breathing techniques. In this context, the fact that a human being is not a closed machine comes into play, because regimes are a system that operates through the continuous interaction of chemical, rhythmic, and temporal intervals with the environment. And this system interacts with rhythms at lightning speed to create a kind of harmony. This is not a mystical claim, but a physical and biological reality. For example, the problem of day and night, circadian rhythm, the distribution of light and darkness. This shows that the speed of our biological clock is shaped by its rhythm. Similarly, heart and brain rhythms also vary according to their intensity. The rhythm of nature, music, social interaction, stress, and even potential living beings also have these rhythms. Therefore, poetic expressions like harmony with the planet are not actually a direct metaphor, but a reality based on the integrity of nature's rhythms. Because similar frequencies enter into frequency, just like all the harmony characteristics of instruments playing in the same key in a music orchestra, working speeds also work more smoothly in harmony with temperature rhythms. This harmony can be observed not only in individual experiences, but also in social life. For example, research shows that in a crowded concert environment, people's heart rhythms and brain waves merge to create a collective synchronization. This shows how people create a common rhythm when acting together, and how they strengthen their emotional bonds. Therefore, the relationship between heart rhythm and brain waves is not only a physical phenomenon, but also a social one. Because when people live together, they interact with each other's rhythms, and this interaction can strengthen emotional bonds, increase empathy, and ensure social survival. This shows us that humans are not just thinking beings. They are a vibrational system that creates harmony and rhythm with their environment. Regulating the rhythms of this system is crucial, not only for mental health, but also for physical, emotional, and social health. And perhaps the real question is, how much of this rhythmic sleep have we lost? How much are we rediscovering? And how can this harmony be regained in the face of the constraints of modern life? Because modern life, with its constant stimuli, screen light, stress, and fast pace, desensitizes us to external rhythms while deafening us to our internal rhythms. Therefore, heart-brain sleep is not just a spiritual idea, but a measurable state of health and consciousness. Therefore, being able to monitor your heart rate, breathing regularity, and brain waves is not only a way to get to know ourselves better, but also a fundamental step towards living a more harmonious and organized life in our home environment. The moment the walls collapse, do separate minds really exist? One of the greatest illusions in human history may be the belief that the mind is entirely personal, entirely separate, and entirely a closed box. Because in daily life, we experience our thoughts as a private substance circulating within the self, as if each of us were a solitary individual in our own cage, interacting with the outside world only through a limited door. But the truth is, we accept this boundary so strongly that we don't even consider questioning its reality. Now let's stop and think. Have you ever felt someone's pain without putting it into words? Have you experienced moments when you understood something someone didn't want to say, thanks to a micro expression on their face or a tremor in their voice? Or moments when you suddenly felt something was going to happen, but there was no logical evidence to explain it? These are often called intuition, and we tend to see them as a mysterious force, an inexplicable secret. However, neuroscience defines intuition in a completely different way. Intuition is the rapid and automatic interpretation of data that the brain has gathered in the subconscious. That is, a kind of super-fast calculation. The brain evaluates very small details such as micro-expressions, tones of voice, body language, environmental cues, and past experiences in as little as 1,000th of a second and presents them to us as feelings. Therefore, intuition is not a mysterious force. On the contrary, it is the result of a highly sophisticated information processing system. But the problem is not just intuition. The problem is whether minds are truly completely separate. Because modern neuroscience does not see empathy simply as understanding another person's feelings. It defines empathy as the activation of the same neural networks within the brain itself. So when you observe someone, even if you don't imitate their movements, your brain recreates the pattern of that movement within itself. You not only understand that person, you experience them within yourself. This is not a mystical merging of minds. It is a fundamental working principle of the nervous system. What you're thinking right now is, but isn't this just empathy? Aren't our minds still separate? Yes, there is a degree of separation. However, this separation isn't as sharp as we think. And here's the critical point. If minds aren't completely separate, why don't we often feel this reality? Because modern life constantly traps us in the idea of I. Society, the education system, the workplace, and the media define the individual as a self-sufficient, independent being. Yet the truth is, humans are evolutionarily relational beings. Humanity's survival has been possible not through loneliness, but through connection. At this point, it's necessary to remember the words of Carl Jung, one of history's greatest thinkers. Jung said that the human psyche is shaped not only by the individual, but also by a collective consciousness. In other words, we are within a mental space shaped not only by our own experiences, but also by the shared experience of humanity. And Jung's idea aligns strikingly with today's neuroscience data, because modern psychology shows that what we call the mind is not just the product of a single organ, but rather a network of systems. The brain, heart, body, emotions, social environment, and culture all work together. Therefore, what we call the mind is not limited to a single person. The boundaries of the mind are as open as the boundaries of the body. Now I will present you with an even more striking thought. The walls between minds are often built by us. And these walls can be strongest even where people are closest to each other. For example, in family, in a circle of friends, in love. The moment you think you truly know someone, you implant your own narrative about their inner world so strongly that you begin to ignore the other person's reality. This is the human self-justification mechanism. Because the human mind, while constantly trying to understand the world, also tries to control the world. And to control often means to set boundaries. But there's a paradox here. The stronger the walls between minds become, the more alone one feels. But when the walls weaken, one feels more authentic. Therefore, the moment the walls fall, isn't just about one person understanding another. The moment the walls fall is the moment one begins to realize one's own limitations. Another interesting fact is this: people sometimes feel like themselves when they are with one person, but lose themselves when they are with another. This is related to love, trust, and commitment. Because when we connect, our brain begins to perceive the other's existence as part of our own existence. This has also been scientifically proven. In a relationship, when two people connect, their brain activity becomes more similar. This applies not only to romantic relationships, but also to friendships, family, and team bonds. So why is this important? Because it shows that a person is not just an individual being, but also a shared system. And this raises the question, do walls really exist, or are we just thickening them? The answer to this question is related to how a person constructs their inner world. Because the moment a person labels their thoughts and feelings as I, they also limit them. And limiting also means limiting the other. Therefore, breaking down the walls between minds is not just about more empathy. It is also about seeing more reality. Because reality is not only made up of things that are mine, it is also made up of things that we live with. Many great thinkers have acknowledged this truth. For example, Albert Einstein said that man's greatest illusion is I. Einstein believed that man seeing himself at the center of the universe was both a scientific and moral error. Because the universe is not at man's center, man is a part of the universe. And this, at the most fundamental level, means the connection of minds. Because the mind is not just the functioning of an individual organ. The mind is a form of existence. A person's thought is not just the functioning of their own brain. Thinking is also a combination of environment, culture, past, and future. Therefore, perhaps the most accurate question should be, are minds separate or interconnected? No. How well do we remember the connection between minds? Because humans are far more relational beings than we think. And humanity's greatest strength is not being alone. It is connecting. Why was this information dangerous? Some information shakes humanity's deepest security mechanisms, not because it is false, but because of the possibility that it might be true. Therefore, throughout history, the most feared and censored ideas have been considered dangerous precisely because they are closest to the truth. Itzhak Bentov's courage lies precisely here, because instead of treating consciousness as a sacred, abstract part of the soul, or a mystical realm, he chose to preserve it as a measurable process. And in doing so, directly targeted humanity's most fundamental assumptions about itself. Bentov attempted to define consciousness not merely as an internal experience, but as an observable system formed by a combination of medical treatment, heart rhythm, brain waves, and physical resonances. A method that, while sometimes arousing a certain excitement, triggers the most defensive reflexes in others, while questioning the area that science teaches. Because Bentov, as a scientist, instead of using the word consciousness as a mystical symbol, sought to express it through concepts such as frequencies, regularity, resonance, and systemic integrity. In other words, consciousness, its emergence, was not a spiritual secret, but the product of a natural mechanism. And understanding this mechanism led to man seeing himself not only as an individual, but also as a node within a system. This is precisely why Bentov's terrorist was dangerous. Because personal consciousness is not something that arises only in the brain. And if the human mind can exist within a larger system, then the idea of control, one of the most fundamental aspects of the modern system, begins to be questioned. Because the extent to which what we think we control is actually under our control casts a shadow over the entire regime that governs the individual's life, the education system, health policies, and even the security structure. This idea is not merely a formal debate. It also radically changes the way people interact with each other. Because when what we call self reaches its limits, it becomes a restructuring and redefinition of beings within a conscious environment. And this environment is only consumed, adapted, or followed by the universe. This is what the existing order fears most. It regulates content and fears questions most of all. Because questioning prevents a person from submitting to authority, and Bentov's approach directly threatens the viewpoint that systems see people only as tools, as it came to redefining human consciousness. Bentov's claims were even more dangerous because they were not like mystical prophecies, but rather attempts were made to support them with engineering logic and standard observation. Because while people generally dismiss falsehoods as unbelievable, it is more difficult to reject a scientific claim, and this can strengthen the defensive reflexes of systems. Therefore, Bentov's work sparked debate in academic circles, because when the scientific world accepts a theory within the freedoms and limitations of a discipline and system of thought, the dominance of that discipline begins to be questioned in the established field. Therefore, the plane crash that led to Bentov's death is seen not merely as an isolated event, but as a turning point. Because while some historians and researchers debate whether such events are coincidences or the end of knowledge, what matters is not the speculation, but the impact on the minds of the individuals involved, and especially details like the breaking of Bentov's personal notes. These details explain why this knowledge was broken. Because such knowledge makes it difficult to determine precise quantities for human existence. If humanity is a process and death is not merely a break, but a transformation or some other transitional phase, then humanity's fear, need for control, and search for meaning change radically, and this change directly challenges many institutions and systems in general. In many cultures, death is seen as humanity's greatest fear, presented as an end, and this end is one of the strongest motivations that keeps humanity within a certain order of existence. However, Bentov's approach offers a door that can support death not merely as a physical separation, but as something that makes it difficult for humanity to confront the idea of eternity. Throughout history, plans for eternity have been dangerous for many power centers, because eternity leads humanity to live not with fear, but with curiosity. And curiosity leads humanity to question the system, not to follow it. Therefore, in some systems, the mind is always in its worst state, because the system prefers humanity not in its best state, but in its most manageable state. Because the manageable person is one who does not question, who submits, and who only accepts what is given. Bentov's work treats the process of self-knowledge as a measurable energy consciously produced by humanity, occurring in short journeys lasting minutes, leading humanity to see itself not merely as a body, but also as an energy system. This shakes humanity's most fundamental belief: I am only a body. Because Bentov's approach suggests that consciousness is a process, and that expansions are continuous. That is, death may not be a sun, but the beginning of another order. And this is why this knowledge is dangerous. It has the potential to awaken rather than frighten, and proposes rewriting human existence not merely as a story of survival, but as a story of understanding. Therefore, Bentov's importance is debated today because despite the interruptions, the remaining thoughts offer unsettling but fruitful explanations that lead to the rediscovery of humanity, and systems prefer quiet but controllable thoughts rather than fruitful ones. Perhaps the reason this knowledge was dangerous was not that it was wrong, but that it might be right. Because if true, it would force humanity to rewrite social order and the world's most fundamental control mechanisms. See IA documents and the gateway process. One of the most fundamental realities of human history is that some individuals are ridiculed in the world, while behind the scenes they continue to be studied with great seriousness. And these two realities can coexist because a community's official mind and secret mind often reside in different universes. The gateway process is a concept situated precisely in the middle of this dual reality. What appeared as a standard method in official form was also a gateway to research that pushed the boundaries of official memory. And this gateway was located in one of the most secretive corridors of the Cold War era's knowledge and power race. In the late 1970s and early 1980s, U.S. intelligence agencies began systematically investigating alternative pathways to different regions of human consciousness. This research was not the product of mystical curiosity, but the result of a unified effort. Because a country that discovered a method of increasing the potential of the human mind could gain an advantage beyond classical methods of intelligence, and this advantage was seen as a kind of symbol of power in the political balance of that era. This programming logic was actually based on a question directly targeting human existence. Is the mind limited only by what the senses perceive, or can these resources be expanded in some way? And if it can be expanded, what characteristics of this expansion make access to intuition and perhaps the subconscious possible? The technique described in the transition process stories was far from creating hallucinations. Because the aim was not to put the mind into a random sleep, but to separate the noise of the mind, to make perception clearer and more holistic. And this was not just a practice of focusing, but a process of breathing, rhythm, concentration, and discipline. This method aimed to interfere with the normal part of the mind by combining heart rhythm, brain waves, and focus, making it more orderly and profound. That is, it did not provide the mind with a calmer, clearer, and higher level of security. The most striking detail is that the technical and analytical language used in the documents shows that this method existed not as a mystical ascension or spiritual experience, but as a measurable system. Because here, consciousness is not a matter of belief, but something that is shaped. The process described in the document uses concepts such as management, resonance, wave, and frequency, not as metaphors, but as measurable policies. That is, mind is considered an energy system, and the regulation of this system is logically approached in a manner similar to adjusting a physical machine, because the mind itself is seen as a system, and it is assumed that systems can be optimized. Officially, the most valuable thing for states is not whether a hidden truth exists, but whether it is usable, because the logic of a system is not to awaken humanity, but to increase power and control. Therefore, if a method begins to work, even if it is not definitively proven, it is kept secret and used only in certain circles. The real issue is not the CIA or the documents. The real issue is this: if human consciousness can be trained, directed, and kept within the limits of conventional perception, then humanity has a far greater potential than we imagine. And this is because human consciousness undergoes a broader transformation. Humanity's view of the world changes. The world ceases to be merely an object and becomes a relationship. And this relationship leads humanity to understand itself not as an integration of the universe, but as a part of the universe. This is why the transition process is not just a technique. It is also unique. It is a threshold, a time between the known and the unknown, between the rejected and the used. And history shows us that some doors have closed. The existence of this key demonstrates how dangerous, and at the same time, how powerful, pushing the boundaries of human memory can be. Because information is used not only to acquire knowledge, but also to control. And therefore, the idea of the recorded consciousness is a force that both liberates humanity and reshapes the control mechanisms of systems. And perhaps the most unsettling truth is this: studies like the transition process not only remain at the point of separation of minds, but also make it difficult for humanity to see itself as just a body, because human consciousness is treated as a system. Human existence is understood as part of a larger network, and this network connects humanity not in isolation, but within itself. Therefore, if this process is real, and if the human mind can truly connect with a wider realm, then humanity's greatest potential may lie not outside, not inside, but beyond the boundaries of the mind. And this disruption could lead to humanity rewriting itself. And perhaps this is why the transition process is formally rejected, because some truths, if accepted, awaken people, and a sleeping society is easier to control than an awakened one. Is consciousness a system or a byproduct? For many years, modern science argued that consciousness was a byproduct of complex information structures. That is, when the brain reached a sufficiently complex order, consciousness emerged as a result of unraveling, like the operation of a car engine. And this result was merely a mechanical side effect, not considered the fundamental work of the universe. However, from the 20th century onwards, the reality revealed by quantum physics in particular began to shake these ideas. Because in the quantum world, particles do not exist individually. There is no current, and they are simply stuck in a particular instantaneous state through an observation, a communication, or a measurement, meaning that even at the smallest level of the universe, existence is somehow a flash, a continuation of a flash, and a burning. From the perspective of modern physics, this is not just a technical detail, but a deeper question. If the existence of a particle is not certain until it is measured, is reality something that occurs in a single place? Or is the entire universe a system where its properties are interconnected like a network? This question also applies to consciousness, because if the universe is a unified network, then consciousness may not be merely a byproduct of what is produced in the brain, but rather an order, a form of communication that emerges within this network. Quantum physicist David Bohm, using the term hidden order, stated that the universe is not simply the sum of its parts, but that a deeper whole exists. This idea suggests that awareness is not merely a biological byproduct, but may be part of a larger system. According to Bohm, everything visible in the universe is part of a deeper order, and this order is greater than the sum of its parts. This perspective opens the door to the idea that consciousness may not be merely a byproduct produced by the brain, but one of the ways the universe perceives itself, one of the ways it makes sense of itself. At this point, the concept of energy gains importance, because physics now considers properties not only as motion, but also as a structure containing order and information. Einstein's famous E equals mc squared equation, which shows that energy can be converted into matter, also explains that the universe is not something fixed and solid, but a constantly transforming and reshaping fabric. Energy is not just the displacement of something, but also the emergence of order and information structure. That is, the universe is not an empty stage, but a living fabric composed of constantly vibrating and interacting parts. This brain is not just an organ. It is a system that operates with electrical and magnetic signals, part of the universe's energy network. The brain constantly measures, filters, and models the information it receives and the electrical and chemical communication between formations. Although this process is seen by external systems as merely a neural process, it is actually an interaction taking place in the universe's information network. Therefore, consciousness cannot be considered a closed box. Just as electrical circuits in a network are constantly interacting with external energy fields, consciousness can be considered an open system in this field. This idea is not a mystical claim, but a natural extension of systems theory. Because systems theory states that we cannot deduce an organism, an ecosystem, or an indicator solely from the individual behavior of its parts. An ecosystem cannot be viewed from the perspective of a single organism. Rather, what is seen among all the parts is different. The ecosystem has its own order, a state of equilibrium. Similarly, consciousness is not merely the sum of events, but a network of distributions formed by the distributions and the interaction of this network with the environment. Therefore, some neurologists and physicists argue that consciousness is not merely a process of the brain, but a dynamic structure constantly exchanging information with the environment. This view is based not on a mystical claim like non-brain consciousness, but on the systems approach of science. Because defining a system solely by physical walls means ignoring what is real. Similarly, human consciousness may not be a closed space within parts, but a system constantly renewed and expanded by the expansion of the environment. This offers a practical benefit, because if consciousness is a system, it can be regulated, expanded, and improved. Thoughts, emotions, and modes of focus are not random, but system settings. Just as humans interact with a computer, not only through its processor, but also through its operating system, software, and users, consciousness is shaped by support, sleep, movement, activity stimuli, and internal rhythms. Therefore, reducing consciousness to merely the chemistry in the brain, a byproduct, diminishes its magnitude. Considering consciousness as a system in itself means that it can be manipulated and improved. At this point, humanity's current wisdom is in surprising harmony with science. For example, Stoicism views consciousness as an internal order and argues that the storage system must change so that people can control their information. This aligns with modern psychology's cognitive reprocessing approach. Similarly, Buddhism suggests observing the nature of the mind and understanding how memory is recorded. The practice of the mind often leads to a clearer universality by clearing the mind of noise. offering a metaphor parallel to quantum physics' idea of reality clarified by measurement. The idea of an element connecting with the universe doesn't just stem from belief. It becomes a matter of operation. If the universe is an interconnected network and consciousness is part of this network, then learning the connection is not just a romantic notion, but a natural functioning of the system. Although people may appear as separate entities, they can be different nodes in the same place. Like computers located at different points on the internet, each may appear separate, but they are all part of the same network. This possibility does not diminish humanity. On the contrary, it imposes a responsibility on it. Because if consciousness is a system, how we manage our perspective, how we nourish it, and how we create a consciousness order affects not only us, but also all the significant influences within it. This shows that the search for peace within ourselves is not just an individual goal, but a social and universal sphere of influence. Because a system is the whole of the transformation of a part. This shows that consciousness is not just an individual phenomenon, but also part of a collective order. So where does consciousness originate? There is no single answer to this question. Because consciousness may not originate from a single source, but from a characteristic resulting from the self-reorganization of a network. If it were a conscious product, it would be just a coincidence. But if consciousness is a system, then consciousness is the way the universe makes sense of itself, and we are a part of this meaning-making. Therefore, the real question becomes, where does consciousness come from, and what do we do with it? The answer to this question lies not only in the laboratories of scientists, but also in the inner world of people, in the depths of philosophies, and in the wise words of history. Because viewing science as a byproduct narrows its scope, while seeing student consciousness as a system expands people's potential and invites them to take on greater responsibilities. If your brain is connected to the universe, the real question is, why do we remember this? If your brain is connected to the universe like a network, and your consciousness is actually part of this larger system, the real question is, why do we remember this? Because this is not just a matter of curiosity. It is also key to understanding how the boundaries considered normal in human life, boundaries constructed by society and the mind, are formed. At first glance, this question seems like a flaw in the human mind. However, when you look at the change, forgetting is actually an evolutionary function of existence, an adaptation, and also a way for the system to protect itself. Because in every period of humanity, not remembering the unknown has generally been perceived not as a luxury, but as a risk. And this risk concerns not only the individual, but also the sustainability of the social order. 1. Because the system is built to make us normal. Society trains individuals to survive and adapt within the system, because society needs to conform to certain behavioral patterns in order to survive. This situation manifests itself from childhood. The concepts of right and wrong are generally taught not to tell the truth, but to ensure survival. Everyone is expected to live by the same rules, at home, at work, and even among friends. While this may seem like a recorded reality, it is actually a measure of a system's ability to sustain itself. Because individual freedom could disrupt system stability, the system encourages people to be normal. Sociologist Emil Durkheim argues that individuals in society are shaped by certain norms, and that an individual may be ostracized by society if they conform to these norms. This helps us understand why the remembering of consciousness is not made difficult. Because remembering requires a person to question their norms and step outside their comfort zone. The fundamental aim of society is to draw its individuals into the system. What we are talking about in this reality is generally a framework that is taught to us. This framework does not encompass the boundless nature of the universe. The universe has no boundaries. Thought and energy contain boundless richness, but we limit everything we call reality, the education system, its volume, and its environment, with its limitless boundaries. As a result, our minds eventually accept this range as correct and perceive everything else as wrong or dangerous. 2. Because consciousness emerges most in silence. Modern life is a constant bombardment of stimuli. Phone notifications, social media, news, fast pace, and constant distractions can dull the most fundamental aspects of consciousness: introspection. When the brain is constantly locked onto the external world, opportunities for introspection, and therefore the parts related to remembering, atrophy. From a neuroscientific perspective, in response to external stimuli, the brain loses the silence it needs for its own internal turning. Because external stimuli constantly trigger the dopamine system, making it difficult for the mind to turn towards inner awareness. In this way, practices such as being alone and spending long periods of time lead to consciousness re-remembering itself. Because these practices allow the brain to shift from an externally focused mode to an internally focused mode. The initial awakening experiences are often like this. Something has changed, but what has changed? This something is the accumulation that results from the brain being locked into both the external and internal worlds. At that moment, the person begins to hear their inner voice for the first time, and this voice often reveals a long-suppressed truth. This is a kind of remembering. However, remembering this can be an improvement for many people, as it can lead them to question their own lives, choices, and patterns. 3. Because remembering disrupts the comfort zone. Remembering involves connecting with the universe and accepting people. However, this transformation also brings responsibility. Because true connection arises not from passively living, but from actively making choices. This structurally requires being able to ask, "Is this all my life is?" And this question disrupts the comfort zone. For most people, the comfort zone means security because events and changes trigger survival mechanisms. Evolutionarily, the brain has learned to avoid risk because risk is inherent in survival. Therefore, remembering is perceived as a kind of risk, because remembering requires the individual to take control, overcome their fears and limitations, and actually survive. This means that a situation deemed safe by the system must emerge. Therefore, the mind chooses to forget, because forgetting provides explanations within the system. But this is not just an individual choice, but also a survival strategy. 4. Because we become victims of the mind. The mind tries to control everything for its own comfort, because control guarantees its survival rights. It constantly analyzes, calculates, plans, and tries to predict outcomes. But in this process, it suppresses our emotions, silences our inner voice, and prevents us from questioning the privacy of our lives. Modern psychology has perpetuated this situation as the mind's defense system, because the mind perceives confronting the unknown as a threat. This attempt at control prevents the individual from seeing their true inner world. However, connecting with the universe comes not from controlling the mind, but from storing information within it. The mind is a tool, but we see it as the master. This is one of humanity's greatest illusions, because the mind constructs everything we define as self, but it can also enslave us. At this point, philosophers and wise men have been saying the same thing for thousands of years. Knowing oneself and observing the mind are the beginning of true freedom. Socrates' saying, "Know thyself," is not only liberal advice, but also an expression of the deepest truth about consciousness. Because when a person knows themselves, they see the limits of memory and rediscover their connection with the universe. 5. Because forgetting is actually protection. Consciousness sometimes chooses to forget to protect us, because some of the knowledge we possess about the universe requires humanity to make great progress, and this responsibility allows the individual to comfortably avoid it. The brain operates according to survival criteria, and for survival, a simple life, low risk, low questioning, and low depth are generally considered safer. Therefore, information is perceived as a risk because the person who remembers it is forced to change their life. This change affects social relationships, work life, values, and abilities. That's why the mind often chooses to forget, because forgetting is a kind of protective option. However, this is a recurring theme in human history. Great awakenings are often met with social pressure because the awakened individual questions the pre-accepted norms within the system. Therefore, awakening often comes with loneliness and exclusion. But this loneliness is also a choice because the awakened individual no longer sees reality, but the system. 6. And most importantly, because this remembering is your choice. But let me tell you this process is entirely under your control. If your brain is connected to the universe, this is a matter of choice connection. The small choices you make throughout the day determine the dimensions and connections of these particles. Which ones do you nurture? Which thought patterns do you constantly repeat? How much do you listen to your inner world? What do you consider a trap? And what do you reject? These aren't just psychological questions. They're questions about how we connect with the universe. Because the universe is made up of our thoughts, our emotions, and our choices. This isn't just a metaphor. It's the truth of systems theory and quantum physics. Forgetting is the mind's defense mechanism. Knowing is an awakening. And this awakening is liberating as it progresses. Because when a person begins to see their own consciousness as a system, they can reorganize their experiences and exist more harmoniously with the universe. Know this: you are not alone. You are a part of this universe, and the universe is the sum of its members, your members, and your choices. So the real question isn't, why don't you remember? No, what are you not ready to remember? And the answer to that question will change the end of your life.